It's my great joy to welcome you to our first session in the Text and Context series. In our first podcast, we're going to be exploring scriptural texts from Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions because we want to seek their wisdom on the long-running and very current issues surrounding refugees. Joining me today from the Muslim faith are Hamza Zahid, a student of traditional Islamic scholarship and an economist and social researcher. Also with us is Abdul Rahman Malik, lecturer and associate research scholar at the Yale Divinity School. From the Jewish faith, we have Rabbi Lindsay Taylor-Goodhartz, who's a research fellow at Manchester University. She was recently ordained a rabbi in the Orthodox tradition by Yeshiva Maharat in New York. We also welcome Rabbi in Training Miriam Laurie, formerly of the Cambridge University Interfaith Programme. Welcome to you both. And my Christian colleagues are Ben Quash, Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College London, and Dr. Gemma Simmons, a sister of the Congregation of Jesus and past president of the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain. Thank you both for being with us. First of all, I'd love to hear from each of you a little about your own journey towards the practice of scriptural reasoning and why you think it's important. So can I start with you, Lindsay, please?
Well, I've been doing scriptural reasoning for about, 20 years now. And I love it because it affords me not only an opportunity to explore other scriptures, but always returns me to my own scripture with something new I hadn't thought about. So I find it illuminating and creative.
Thank you. And it's brought long-term friendship, hasn't it, for so many of us? So, Hamza, how about you?
Yes, well, my journey with SR began in 2018 on an interfaith program run by an organization called Rosecaster Foundation, run by somebody who you may know called Sarah Snyder, the most wonderful individual, and with her and with other wonderful interfaith leaders, I was shown the ropes of interfaith and have been involved ever since.
Thank you, Hamza. That's wonderful. And Gemma?
Well, my doctoral supervisor some 20 years ago here in Cambridge was Professor David Ford, who at the time was Mr. Scriptural Reasoning. And you couldn't be anywhere near David without picking up his passion and enthusiasm for scriptural reasoning. And I caught it. It was contagious. And as has been said before, it opens a window not only to other people's sacred texts, but by allowing them to share their understanding as well, it shines a completely new light on your own text, and it adds depth and breadth and richness to your own understanding.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. Abdul?
I've kind of always viewed scriptural reasoning as a kind of a spiritual banquet. We come and everyone offers all these lovely gifts and delicacies, and it feeds you and it feeds your soul. And I often find that after scriptural reasoning, the resonances and the flavors of it stay for a long time. And I feel incredibly gratified and honored to have been given such an insight into other texts. And like my friends have said here, as we gain insight into other texts, we also become reflexive and reflective about our own. And there's something quite alchemical about that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Miriam?
My journey with SR began when I was a student at university and it was happening locally. So I went along. I was a bit too scared to open my mouth at the beginning, but I actually did have a sort of almost semi-religious experience in an SR group once, where I just imagined everyone in the room's souls kind of dancing together above the text. And now I'm a few years on and I can open my mouth in the sessions and I just love it evermore.
Oh, that's wonderful, Miriam. Thank you. And Ben, you've probably been our longest scriptural reasoner on here with us.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be the first academic director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme when it began. And the backbone of that programme was always scriptural reasoning, even though there were all sorts of practical projects. We felt that at the heart of it, there needed to be something that we did for its own sake, for the sheer joy of it. And so that all the sort of useful things we hoped to do would spring from something that was done just for delight. And scriptural reasoning is that meeting of people in what we used to think of as a tent of meeting, even though we might belong to our separate religious houses, whether it's synagogue or church or mosque, we come into the tent, into a space where we can be ourselves and yet learn. And it's that particular quality of SR is that you don't need to be, it's not like a lot of interfaith conversation where you sort of immediately try and jump to the things you agree on. You can be yourself. Do something that's natural to you in your own tradition, which is to read scripture closely and lovingly, but find that in doing that, you're brought into friendship with others.
Thank you, Ben. And that image of the tent is such a reminder of Abraham and Sarah welcoming the strangers in the desert, and how what a turn happened when they did that in the encounter they faced. So let's dive straight into the text now. And I just want to turn to the first scriptural text from the Hebrew Bible, Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 to 22. Miriam, would you be happy to just introduce the passage to us?
Okay, well, we're going to meet Moses, the young man, before he becomes Moses, the leader. And I think most of us imagine him as either a prince of Egypt or as a powerful leader of the Israelite people. But in fact, what we're going to see here is that he was quite vulnerable and he was a refugee himself. So up to now in the story, he's been brought up in Pharaoh's palace. He's been given a load of privileges, while at some point knowing that he was an Israelite. And what's going to happen in our text is he's going to discover this kind of huge identity crisis between the Egyptian in him and the Israelite inside him. And he's going to kind of explode on that and have to run away. And we're going to see 3 different scenes of his heroism. So I won't kind of give it away, but look out for those 3 scenes as we read. And we're going to see that even on the run as a refugee, he's what we would call in Judaism a mensch. He's a really decent guy. And even though he's the victim, he's going to look out for other people and show his heroism. And we're going to see how he's welcomed really beautifully and unquestionably by the priest of Midian, who here is called Ruel, elsewhere is called Yitro in Hebrew, and is going to become Moses' father-in-law. And so his refugee experience is going to go very well, because not only does he find a mentor in Ruel, but he finds a wife. And that's going to be, so look out for the well scene, because the well is the kind of dating site of the ancient Near Middle East. So he's going to fall in love, and in some ways this is going to be the happiest, most settled time in his whole entire career.
Thank you, Miriam. Lindsay, are you happy to recite the Hebrew?
Yes, and I'll do it in the chant that's used when we read the Torah publicly in synagogue. Vayhi bayamim hahem, vayiktal Moshe v'yetze lechav, vayar besiflotam, vayar ish mitri makeh shifri mechav, vayifen kovacho, vayar ki ein ish, vayach et mitri, vayitmenehu bachol. ויצא ביום השני והנה שני אנשים עברים ניצים ויאמר לרשע למה תכרך ויאמר משמך לאיש שר ושופט עלינו על הרגני אתה אומר כאשר הרגת את המצרי וירא משה ויאמר אכן נודע הדבר, וישמע פרעה את הדבר הזה, ויבקש להרוג את משה, ויברח משה מפני פרעה, וישב בארץ מדיין, וישב על הבאר. ולכהן מדיין 7 בנות, ותבואנה ותדלנה, ותמלאנה את הרהיטים, להשקות צאן אביהם. ויבואו הרועים ויגרשום, ויקום משה ויושיען, וישק את צאנם. ותבואנה אל רעואל אביהן, ויאמר מדוע מיהרתן בו היום. ותאמרנה איש מצרי הצילנו מיד הרועים, וגם דלו דלה לנו, וישק את הצאן. ויאמר אל בנותיו, ואיו, למה זה עזבתם את האיש, כי רן לו ויאכל לחם. ויואל משה לשבת את האיש, ויתן את ציפוריו איתו למשה. ותלת בן, ויקרא את שמו גרשום, כי אמר, גר הייתי בארץ נוכריה.
Thank you, Lindsay. Ben, are you happy to read the English for us? And while Ben reads, can I just invite everybody to think of a word or a phrase that jumps out at you, either because it's surprising or interesting or you don't understand it for any reason? Ben, thank you.
Sometime after, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived, settled in the land of Midian, and sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread." And Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as wife. She bore a son, whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land."
Thank you, Ben. So can I invite you to share a word or a phrase that leapt out for you? In any order.
I always find the end of that passage, "I'm a stranger in a foreign land," or "a stranger in a strange land," really, really compelling, because Moses seems to say this after an entire a dramatic arc of events. And in a way, at that part of the story, he is no longer a stranger or foreigner in a sense, because he has now become part of a family far away from the place which he came from, and yet he feels strangeness and foreignness. And that paradox always struck me about these verses.
I'm very struck by the father saying to his daughters, "Why did you leave him then?" And actually, if you think of the context, this Egyptian, this stranger who is not only not known to them, but clearly not of their own people, puts himself out fairly spectacularly to help them. And they all just kind of leave him and disappear off back home. And so there's a whole wealth of expectation or non-expectation there of how we make people feel at home, or how people enter into our lives and how we interact with them. And throughout this story, there are people of authority, whether it's Pharaoh or whether it's the priest of Midian, who are using their authority to say who belongs and who doesn't. And yet here, he's obviously transcending the expected patterns of belonging to say, this man did something for you as one human being to another, and therefore he belongs. Therefore, he's at home with us. So why didn't you bring him home? And that strikes me very powerfully about who we allow into our home, whether it's the home of our physical home or the home of our circle of friends, the home of our own life. And what are the criteria by which we judge whether we allow someone in or not?
I would like to pick up one word, which is really two. It appears in the translation as the word rescued, and Moses is described twice as rescuing the daughters of Jethro, but it's two different words in the Hebrew, lahoshia and lahatzil, and that's quite interesting. They're both used of God. Lahoshia is more to save, lahatzil is perhaps more to deliver or rescue in that sense, but the thing that I note about them is here is this person who is a refugee, who's running away, who might be prosecuted or killed if he returned to his place of origin. He has nothing at all. He has nothing going for him, but he can still have the agency to save other people and to turn up in the role of a deliverer from a position of absolute vulnerability and dependence. So that one really leaps out at me.
You just said, Lindsay, about a word which might mean two things or something like that. But it seems like another possibility there, which really intrigued me, is that arrived or settled in the land of Midian. So for me, that's especially interesting. The difference between arriving and settling seems quite significant. And it's particularly odd to settle somewhere which is neither the place Moses has grown up, which is Egypt, nor with his kinspeople, which are the Hebrews, but a third place. So, he's left unsettled relationships with both Egyptians and Hebrews behind him, and he's finding some sort of settled relationship, it seems, with a third group, the Midianites, and that sense of where you can settle, where you can abide or rest. And sometimes the surprises of where you find you can abide or rest really intrigue me.
And just picking up on what Ben says, it's Miriam here. When the daughters report to their father, they say, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what your own inner identity is, you're still going to have labels put on you by other people. And they mean well, don't they? But I'm imagining that refugees today get labels put on them. They come from one place, even though their own identity might be from another.
Yeah, I found the dynamics of group identity very, very interesting here. So you've kind of got three different groups. You've got the Egyptians, you've got the Hebrews, and then you've got the people of Midian as well. And we see a lot of nuance in each of those identity groups. So you can see that the Hebrews, they kind of quarrel amongst themselves as well. So when Moses tries to arbitrate between them, there's a little bit of tension. Yet when Moses kind of flees to Midian, he's regarded as an Egyptian. And I think the reason why I find that very powerful is because it's really breaking down group identity, and it's showing us that groups are not monoliths. And so we shouldn't regard different groups, people who are different to ourselves, as monolithic. There's all sorts of tensions and dynamics that exist within each group. And I thought there's so much nuance here from a sociological perspective. If we think about migration and diaspora communities, it's all here. It's very, very rich.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a bit like when people say women, and you think, who are we talking about? Because, a woman in a refugee camp in Sudan, a woman on Fifth Avenue, and, Queen Elizabeth of England, they're all women. But apart from that, what on earth do they have in common? And yet, so many of these kind of essentialist comments are made about, women or men or foreigners or whatever it is. And we shove them all together in a group and think we can make comments that are coherent about a group who are clearly very, very different from one another. So, a health warning about putting labels on people.
I also like what you
Whatever
said.
sort of label.
So I also liked what you said because there's no attempt in this text to make any group out to be the goodies or the baddies. So among the Hebrews, you have two fighting, and among the Midianites, you have the group of men who are kind of harassing these women trying to water their flocks. And so it's more about who are the good people, kind of regardless of identity. And Moses clearly comes across as one of them.
To pick up on that, it's interesting that in a way Moses seems to be having to work this out himself during the course of the passage, because his initial reason for killing is that it's one of his own that's being attacked, it seems. And then, and he appeals to the two Hebrews fighting on the same grounds, you should be sticking together, not fighting each other. So he's working with quite sort of discrete, clear, separate identities there, and he's making his judgments about whether to say don't fight or do kill on the basis of those. And yet suddenly he's the recipient of this hospitality in Midian, which completely, perhaps, I don't know, maybe that completely surprised him. And he's suddenly married to a Midianite. So you see in the course of this short passage a sort of opening up, disintegration and opening up of the idea of these boundaried identities.
And I think that links on to another aspect of the well, because in this story and others, the well is a testing place. So the best example is the servant of Abraham coming to the well and asking God to reveal to him who will be the bride of Isaac, and Rebecca passes the test. So in some senses, coming to a well places you in a place where you have to make choices, where you have a test of your own reactions. So we could perhaps contrast that then with what you were saying about the test that perhaps Moses fails or doesn't pass very well back in Egypt, and then is given a replay, and this time chooses to champion the underdogs, if you like, or chooses to champion those in need, those who are vulnerable, who aren't members of his own group.
And yet, Miriam and Lindsay, this attestation, this confession of strangeness remains after all of that, after the welcome, after the marriage, after the establishment of a home and a life. And I wonder if the language in the original language, if there's some clues around this idea of being a stranger or being a foreigner or continuing to feel so.
I think so, because the word for a stranger is ger, which of course is this root of the name Hagar, another quintessential stranger certainly in Genesis. So I feel that he's saying perhaps that no matter how he's integrated, he still retains his original identity. And so for him, the new place will to some extent always be strange. Just because you integrate, you settle down, it doesn't cancel out your core identity or birth identity or original identity, which again, I think is something that refugees sometimes struggle with, people expecting them to become whatever, as a member of whatever community they've moved to. But that sadness at losing your original community and your links to it never go. And I think that's perhaps one aspect of what we see with Moses here, that retention of your original identity, even when you're quite happily situated later on.
I don't know if I'm reading a bit too much into it, but do you think he could also be saying that he was a stranger in his birthplace land as well? That he's never really not been a ger. He's always had some kind of mismatch of identity.
That's such a powerful idea, Miriam, and I resonate with it, because the notion of strangeness or being out of place is actually within the Islamic mystical and Sufi literature is almost like a spiritual station. The Prophet Muhammad talks about, the faith coming as something strange and then eventually reverting back to being strange. And so it's really kind of I think that what you just said really kind of sparked that. I'm like, yes, and maybe his sense of strangeness is part of Moses's spiritual character, being someone out of place everywhere, perhaps because of this relationship that he has with the divine, which others don't have, and it kind of sets him apart even in himself.
I love that, and again, at the risk of getting excitable with the text, I think it's almost as though Moses is a watery sort of character. He shares some of the qualities of the water in the well because it's fluid, and so the strangeness is part of the sort of the movability of the medium. And it's interesting that he's also, quintessentially associated with the waters of the Red Sea. Water can be unpredictable and isn't a fixed element. And there's a sense in which Moses isn't quite a fixed element here. Maybe he becomes one but at this stage he isn't yet.
Yes. And that links
and he strikes the rock in the wilderness and water comes out. So water is also nourishing as well as dangerous. It can kill and it can nourish. It can rescue you and it can, destroy you. And so all of these things seem to be part of Moses as well.
It also goes back to his name, which means drawn out of the water, referring to when he's a child and he's adrift in that little box on the waters of the Nile. And it links back very nicely with that. And his sister Miriam is also quintessentially associated in Jewish tradition with water. Her name can mean bitter sea. And also to go back to Abdurrahman's suggestion about the qualities of being a stranger or being a stranger in this world. Throughout the Torah, there are, I think, 36 statements to the effect that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, including one version that goes, you should know the heart of a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So again, that would point perhaps to the perpetual quality of always knowing that you yourself are a stranger and recognizing that in other people, which is perhaps what Moses is actually doing in this episode.
Hamza.
Yeah, it reminds me of all the talk about water. It reminds me of something that Bruce Lee mentions. And he just says, be like water. So take on the shape of the container that you find yourself in. And it's similar to what Sheikh Abdul Rahman was saying earlier about kind of I guess, severing our connections, not necessarily severing, but in the absence of too many, let's say, horizontal connections between people, we have room to connect vertically, i.e. to God. And perhaps that's what gives Moses this spiritual strength to be able to continue with good actions, irrespective of where he is. So when he's in Egypt, he's still trying to mediate conflict. He's still trying to stick up for his own people. And when he gets to the watering well, he's still being, I suppose, chivalrous in a sense. So perhaps it's like this vertical dimension that he has with God that enables him to flow into different spaces and to enact good wherever he is.
I wonder if there's also a thing of thinking about where he and anybody else actually is at home. And in this story, it does seem that the one place he really is at home is in God. It's with God that we are truly at home. And yet I have echoing out in my mind a line from the Christian liturgy that says, in our Father's house, we are but passing guests. And I think that if we take that seriously, it obviously has enormous impact on the way that we inhabit the earth and the way we use the things of the earth, the created reality and non-renewable resources and all that. But it also means that if we are truly passing guests who are only at home in God, then every other person has the same status as us. And we can never claim possession as a birthright. This place belongs to me. This space, this time belongs to me. I have ownership, and I will graciously grant it to you if I feel so minded. And it therefore, it proclaims a very, very radical equality of all people, so that the very concept of the refugee is turned into a nonsense in one sense, because we all simultaneously belong primordially in God and actually don't belong in terms of possession anywhere. And therefore we all depend upon one another for welcome. So there's a sort of radical ring in there that is both very challenging and quite exciting.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you all. And sadly, we're going to have to press pause on this discussion and move to our next scriptural passage. As many of you know, these discussions can get deeper and deeper and richer and go on for days on end. So this is just a little snippet. And we're going to move now to our gospel reading from the New Testament. It's the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 34 to 40. Gemma, would you be happy to introduce it to us first?
I would. This is a wonderful piece in the Gospel of Matthew, very dramatic because it's part of a chapter which is all about judgment and the end of time and the criteria by which people will be judged for all eternity. Who's in, who's out. So we have as the background of this God behaving like a shepherd, dividing the sheep from the goats, and therefore looking at, again, who belongs to God and who doesn't. And the audience would have been prepared to hear, I think, about people being judged according to how well they kept the law in all its details. And in the end, Jesus plays a complete googly on them by saying it's got absolutely nothing to do with that. It's got to do with how we treat people. And he takes that even further because he's not just saying, well, this is in a general way, philanthropy is a good thing, but he bases the fundamental judgment for all eternity, how our lives are weighed in the balance, by the extent to which we recognize God in other people, and the extent to which we realize that the way we treat other people is the way we treat God himself. That is massively radical by anybody's standards, both by the standards of the people who heard Jesus at the time. And of course, with these Gospels are the product of a community that was trying to think its way through how to understand the whole Jesus event and how to understand the teachings of Jesus in light of how and where they were living. So they are looking at, who belongs in this community, who doesn't, and what are the criteria that we apply. And the criteria are very surprising. So this is a text that is full of surprises, both for the people of the time it was written, for the people who heard it when it was taught the first time, and for us who read it today.
Thank you, Gemma. Ben, would you like to read the Greek for us?
I'll try. I should just say quickly, one of the wonderful things that I've learned from scriptural reasoning with Muslim and Jewish colleagues is their relationship with the original language of the text. And Christians have a slightly different relationship with the original language because we relate usually to our Bibles through multiple translations, and it's usually we leave the scholars to deal with the Greek and the Hebrew. So, and I'm not a biblical scholar; I'm a theologian. So that's my sort of apology in advance. But I'm going to do my best with the Greek.
Thank you.
Tote ere ho basileus tois ek dexion autu, doite hoi eulogemenoi tu patros mu, kleronomesate ten heto masmenein, humin basilean apokataboles cosmu. Epenesa gar kai educate moi fagein. Edipsesa kai epotisate me. Xenos emen kai sunagagete me. Gumnos kai perie balete me. Esthenesa kai epes, this is the hardest word in the whole thing, epes kepsathe me. En phulake emen kai elthate pros me. Tote apokrithe sontai auto hoi dikaioi legontes, curie, pote se eidomen peinonta, kai ethrepsamen, e dipsonta, kai epotisamen, pote de se eidomen xenon, kai sunagagomen, e gumnon, kai perie balomen, pote de se eidomen asthenunta, e en phulake, kai elthomen prosse. Kai apokrithes ho basileus ere autois, amen lego humin. Ephoson, epoiesa te, eni tuton ton adelphon mu, ton elachiston, hemoi epoiesa te.
Thank you, Ben, very much. Hamza, are you happy to read us the English? And while you do so, can I again invite everybody to think of a phrase or word that stands out for you?
Yeah, sure. As Ben said, he tried his best with the Greek. I'll try my best with the English. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me."
Thank you, Hamza. Open to everyone.
I think the aspect of visiting someone in prison, that's that's radical hospitality. You'd assume that they were in prison for some reason, but even extending hospitality and companionship to people who are in prison, when I think of people that I know are in prison and how difficult that is for me to think, okay, I need to visit these people and give them companionship and nearness despite what's happened. I think that's a radical act of hospitality, and it's quite beautiful that it's conveyed in these terms.
If I can pick up on that, Hamza, I spent 25 years of my life working in a prison in a pastoral role, and you know, however used I got to being inside, when you faced a person and you knew they'd done something truly terrible, and some of the women I worked with had done some terrible, terrible things, to be able to override that and still see their humanity and still have that as the primary thing that you saw and responded to, it was both a huge challenge sometimes, but it was an extraordinary invitation to let go of all one's preconceptions of who's acceptable and who's not acceptable. And it makes immense demands on our understanding of forgiveness and acceptance and reconciliation. So I would agree with you that that's a real biggie in that text.
I think something that jumped out at me was how modest the responders are, how they can't think of a time when they did any of these acts of kindness. And even though Jesus goes on to say it was for the least of these who are members of my family, I'm just really struck by their initial modesty.
And I guess tied to that, Miriam, the notion of an inheritance that they're offered right at the beginning of take your inheritance. And I think that's also part of the surprise is what inheritance? And why am I gaining reward for this thing that I wasn't even aware of that I was doing? And then that following surprise that, you were there, you were present, that God was present, that the divine was present in those places. But how could that even be possible? I think there's this magnanimity and generosity of the divine that we see right at the beginning of these verses, and kind of the overwhelming sense of those who are receiving it, of how they have become worthy of it.
I want to inject a note of questioning here, because this is clearly a parable, a teaching story, and such parables are very, very classical in Jewish rabbinic literature. They come from this period and several centuries later, very much the same thing. And in them, the Jewish parables, the king is always God. So I'm wondering, is the king here God as the king here, Jesus, because the king makes reference to a father, and to brothers. I think the actual Greek says adelphon, about brothers rather than members of my family. So I'm just wondering about the structure of this parable. How does the family relationships work out? What are we being told here? Or are these relationships intentionally being somewhat merged so that they're not hierarchical, they're not actually as clear as we might want them? I can't decide which way it's going, so I don't know if anyone else has some thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, shall I pick up on that? Or well, I mean, yes, the king is Jesus, I think, because there's a section before this, which is about the wicked and those. And so what Miriam very nicely described as the modesty of this lot, of the righteous, has its mirror image in those who didn't do all of these things. And they are as ignorant, if you like, as the righteous about who they're dealing with. But their punishment is great, so that the goats. But the whole thing, both for the wicked and the righteous, is preceded by the statement, when the Son of Man comes in glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne. So the Son of Man is a name for Christ. And in that sense, of course, it's picking up on Hebrew Bible texts like Daniel, but it's got that definite identification with Jesus. So yes, it's him. And in a way, that would be my comment about the text, that it's, for me, the most extraordinary thing about it is the simultaneity of his presence on the throne and in the persons of all of these needy people. So he's both on the throne and in prison, both on the throne and hungry and thirsty and a stranger, all at the same time. And that creates this extraordinary dynamic, which is not surprising that both the wicked and the righteous are completely confused, because he's not where they expect. And yet, and he may not be where they expect in any respect, including on the throne. Does that make sense? So they're all disorientated. So I kind of feel sorry for the wicked too, because they really don't know who they're dealing with. And it's almost as if they couldn't know, just as the righteous don't know.
I had a question about the end that just picks up on some of that really simple question. But how do we understand this idea of, as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me?
Well, I have to say, coming as a member of a religious order, most of the religious orders in Christian history have been founded by people who made a direct connection between the poor and Jesus Christ himself, the kind of when we touch the diseased and the hungry and the thirsty and the hurt flesh of another human person, in a sense, we're touching God, we're touching the divine. And that people like Francis of Assisi saw that very clearly. Mother Teresa of Calcutta saw that very clearly, on the streets of modern day Calcutta. It's been the backbone, the bedrock of the most profound understanding within the Christian community of why it is that care for the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, the stranger is not optional. We can't treat it as an option for when we feel like it or when we feel inspired. It's actually the thing on which our eternal salvation depends. There is no question here.
And that's the awful thing, is that if our eternal salvation depends on it, we don't know. We don't know who we're dealing with. So it's as if you're placed in an almost impossible position. I should, by the way, just correct myself. The wicked come after the righteous. I said that earlier on they were dealt with before in the passage. They're actually dealt afterwards. But I think, Gemma, you were right, because in a way this is saying, calling Christians to recognize that they must look after these groups in order to fulfill all righteousness. At the same time as saying you won't know where Jesus is. He could be anywhere. And which means that in a way you have to sort of not rule anyone out.
Absolutely. And when you look at the history of Christianity, at the history of most religious groups, we've been fabulous at ruling people out one way or the other. And, this is both a very beautiful and an absolutely terrifying text. We should be terrified.
What does it mean when Christians read this as the hungry, as the poor, as those in prison, rather than those who help the hungry and help the poor and help those in prison? Does that change anything?
I mean, I don't want to hog the thing, but I think the only way to hear this text is this is directed at me. Don't worry about what anybody else is doing. Where do you stand with this? What's your record on this? That's the only question that is asked of us.
And to pick up on the text we looked at just before, I mean, there you have Moses himself, a refugee, seeking to serve the women coming to the well. So it's almost as if wherever you are, even if you are in prison, there may be those who you need to seek to serve. So you're never only the one waiting to receive, wherever you are.
But my thoughts again turn to the individuals, to these visitors of the sick and those who are in prison and so on that are referred to right at the beginning, because they didn't do it because Jesus was there or God was there. They did it out of some very deep and profound sense that this is what they were called to do. And I think that's really powerful. Right? It's through their example, the purity of their compassion, their mercy, their generosity, their love, their engagement with the world, that an example is being made of them, as you said, Gemma, for all of us. That look at the example of that. They didn't even know they would find me there, and yet in the subtext between the lines is, they did it anyways. And I'm intrigued by these people who did it anyways, right? Who didn't do it because of the inheritance, who didn't do it because of the reward, but that they were called to do something because it was the right thing to do, the merciful thing to do, the compassionate thing to do, the just thing to do. I think that's really powerful. And how do we, in a way, when we think about as individuals who are engaged in our own faith communities and communities of many faiths, is that how do we train ourselves, first of all, and how do we kind of facilitate communities where the call is not merely to reward or the inheritance or the kingdom, but the call is to something deeper, that it is the fulfillment of our God-given humanity to do this and to engage in this. And we are not fully human until we do so.
Yes, I would say that also comes under the Jewish idea of the pursuit of justice. We have a commandment, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. And that justice is very much in terms of helping those who need it, of restoring equity in society, of lifting up the vulnerable and the oppressed. And that is there as sort of a meta value, if you like. It's a commandment in itself, but it's also a meta value that should guide all your doings. And again, I'm reminded of a rabbinic text that says, don't be like a servant who serves their master in the hope of the reward. Be like a servant who serves their master out of love for the master. So again, it has to be a selfless seeking of justice, a selfless coming to the other's aid.
Thank you all. Do you know, I think, unless anybody's got a burning extra they would like to bring, we're going to move on. Anybody else want to share something before we move on? No, so let's move to the Quranic passage next, which is from Surah 28, verses 20 to 24. Abdul, would you be happy to introduce that for us?
Of course. Thank you very much, Sarah. This is these verses are from, as you said, the chapter 28, Surah 28 of the Quran, Al-Qasas. And the thing that Quran, of course, shares with its other sister texts is a concern with and a highlighting of story. And in many parts of the Quran, God indicates that God is presenting us stories, narratives, anecdotes of the prophets and of the people of the past, in order that we may find wisdom. And so the reading of story in the Quran is wisdom archaeology. We're already starting to read the story and the narrative as a source of wisdom, and because the Quran isn't linear in its storytelling as the Torah or the Bible is, and often stories appear as being sometimes disjointed, and parts of them are addressed in different parts of the Quranic text, because the Quranic text, of course, is not linear even in terms of time or revelation. When these stories appear, they take on a kind of a greater urgency for the Muslim reader. It's like the story has appeared, and now we have to really pay attention, because we're going to capture a fragment of it. I think what's interesting for me is that this surah, this chapter of the Quran, is an almost entirely Meccan revelation. And I think that's important for me as a Muslim reader of the text, is because the Quran in the timeline of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, this part of the Quran is being revealed in this early period, where there's deep oppression, where there is deep chagrin amongst the Meccans, the Quraysh, the people of the Arabian Peninsula, about this faith, which connects itself to the faiths of Jesus and Moses and the prophets of that line. And so I always read these chapters thinking, what must that early community in Mecca, deeply oppressed, deeply marginalized, struggling with what it means to believe, how must they have read this text? And how must they have read particularly this text about Moses? And I think one important thing before we hear Hamza's beautiful recitation of these verses in the Arabic language is, as we're listening, I would sort of encourage myself and my friends to particularly pay attention to the prayers, because really this set of verses is strung together by Moses's prayers. And reading it again in preparation for today, I was struck by how at every moment of difficulty, and even as sometimes difficulty is being apparently resolved, Moses is constantly trying to tether his experience, his fear, his anxiety, his travel, his nervousness to God. And it's quite a powerful tether. So let's hear the verses, and I look forward to all of your insights.
Sure. I'll begin, but I'll mention before it won't be beautiful. Please do bear with me, inshallah. So okay, I'll just get on with it then. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وجاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى قال يا موسى إن الملأ يأتمرون بك ليقتلوك فاخرج إني لك من الناصحين. فخرج منها خائفا يترقب قال ربي نجني من القوم الظالمين. ولما توجه تلقاء مدين قال عسى ربي أن يهديني سواء السبيل. ولما ورد ماء مدين وجد عليه أمة من الناس يسقون ووجد من دونهم امرأتين تذودان قال ما خطبكما قالتا لا نسقي حتى حتى يصدر الرعاء وأبونا شيخ كبير فسقى لهما ثم تولى إلى الظل فقال ربي إني لما أنزلت إلي من خير فقير صدق الله العظيم. There we are.
Shukran. Thank you. Miriam, would you like to read the English for us? And can I encourage any words or phrases or questions that leap out to come to mind as she reads?
With pleasure. Then a man came running from the furthest part of the city and said, Moses, the authorities are talking about killing you, so leave. This is my sincere advice. So Moses left the city, fearful and wary, and prayed, My Lord, save me from people who do wrong. As he made his way towards Midian, he was saying, May my Lord guide me to the right way. When he arrived at Midian's waters, he found a group of men watering their flocks, and beside them 2 women keeping their flocks back. So he said, What is the matter with you 2? They said, We cannot water our flocks until the shepherds take their sheep away. Our father is a very old man. He watered their flocks for them, withdrew into the shade, and prayed, My Lord, I am in dire need of whatever good thing you may send me.
So my most interesting word is withdrew, which comes there in the final the final ayat. But of course he's withdrawn already. So the dynamic of withdrawal and how it's balanced with advancing and doing things like the watering. That's the word that most interested me.
I'm interested in a word from the same ayah, the same verse, and that word is the shade. And I am wondering if there are any mystical connotations of the shade, and because there's not a lot of descriptive richness of scenes in the Quran, so it seems to me that if you're mentioned with shade, it must be significant in some way.
Any other questions? And then let's seek a few thoughts on those.
Our father is a very old man. Is that? It seems a little bit like a non sequitur. Is that their reason for why they can't water their flocks?
Yeah, is it ageism that he has to take second place to the younger ones?
Yeah, or potentially that he can't defend them. So, just survival of the fittest, and the weak ones have to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting observation, Miriam. In the Arabic, it's literally Sheikh al Kabir. It's a kind of an older man, but one who may not be capable anymore of taking care of his flock, and so the agency has now passed to his daughters. His daughters are undertaking now, in a way, the leadership and they have the agency now to take care of the family and the family's flock and the farm and so on and so forth. And I think it's mentioned because as we had talked about in the earlier discussion about the passages referring to the similar story in the Torah there's something here about the women, isn't there? And Gemma asked that question earlier, and we kind of left it a little bit, but I think it's so important. It's these 2 women sort of engaging and taking care of the flock, and they are not. There's a lack of respect for them, isn't there? Why does it take a Moses to come in and say, "Let me take care of this for you"? This isn't acceptable. And I think particularly when he hears that their father is Sheikh al Kabir, is an old man, he immediately recognizes that they have taken on the authority and the responsibility for their family, and there's no one else to help them. Why aren't they recognizing, these shepherds recognizing the situation that they're in, given the kind of the society that they live in? So Miriam, I really appreciate that observation, because it's true. I mean, if if language is with purpose, then what's the purpose of that kind of in a way a kind of and descriptive. And then the other thing I'll say about shade is what a wonderful observation um, about shade, and there is this sense, and I think references to shade appear in various parts of the Quranic text and in the prophetic narration, the narrations of the Sufis and the Imams. Is that shade? There is a shade always associated with the shade of God. Is that when we are entering into shade, there's always that reminder that in the harshness of the surroundings that we're in, shade is given, and this is shade from the shade that is given by God. And so I think that's really consistent, Lindsay, I feel, with the tenor of these verses, which is a Moses constantly withdrawing into the divine presence through prayer, through supplication, through dua. Is that Moses is constantly going into the shade. And in this case, he physically goes into the shade. But I feel like at every moment he experiences challenge here. He finds a kind of a spiritual shade, sustenance, support, connection through these very poignant and sharp prayers that he gives, are intensely personal, intensely about him at the moment that he's seeking God at those very moments of stress.
I really love how this...
Sorry.
Okay, I really love how this text works as a kind of midrash, kind of interpretation or a lens to put on top of the Hebrew Bible text. It's clearly the same story with some details slightly different, and I love how it kind of answers our. It kind of opens up more from the Hebrew Bible text, and this idea that the two women are vulnerable creates a much more obvious parallel vulnerability between Moses and the women than is obvious in the Hebrew Bible text, and so much else. I'd love to hear what other people think opens up or comments on or actually contradicts.
Yeah, I like the vulnerability aspect there, especially that prayer right at the end. It's the Arabic of that prayer, my Lord, I'm in dire need of whatever good. It's really a prayer of immense desperation. So here we are seeing that the vulnerability of Moses is being highlighted throughout. And the answers to that prayer, just the following few verses, will document the same sort of outcome for Moses, that he ends up eventually marrying one of the two women. And I have a cute little story about this set of verses. A very close friend of mine he got married a few weeks ago, and he asked me for some verses from the Quran that he could recite to his wife as soon as they got married. And I suggested these verses. I left out verse 20 because I didn't want his wife to become suspicious of him, that he was being chased by authorities or anything like that. But in this deeply vulnerable state that Moses finds himself in, and in this prayer in which he's asking God, whatever you can give me, I will take. It's a very desperate prayer. And what emerges out of that is employment comes along, but also companionship through a spouse. So I found that to be quite a beautiful idea. So that's a cute little story so these verses, they bring up different themes for me, I suppose. And a lot of scholars actually that pray at the end, a lot of scholars actually recommend it to people who are seeking marriage as well. So it's quite cute, I think.
And the word there is faqir, so it's not only desperation, it's impoverishment. And of course, we know that within the Islamic spiritual and mystical traditions, being one of the fuqara, being faqir, is a spiritual station. And so Moses may at this point not even realize it, but that by sitting under the shade after this act of service to these women, clearly who have taken authority and agency over their and responsibility over their own family, he withdraws, and he in a way may not. It's not even clear from the text that he realizes, but he is in a spiritual station of impoverishment. And when you reach that stage of impoverishment, quite rightly, as you said, Hamza, it's almost like when you reach the state of impoverishment, you recognize it and you realize that only God can resolve that state of being amongst the fuqara, is when these kind of doors of divine grace open to you. So that sense between vulnerability and grace, to use the language that you're using, Miriam, is really powerful. The other thing that occurs to me very quickly is that in that verse 20, where we're told about Moses being informed that his actions have left him in a place where he is facing violence or bodily harm. I always like the beginning of that. So it says, that there came a man running from the furthest end of the city, which sort of as you were saying, Miriam, sort of re-emphasizes what's in the Hebrew text, is that the news of Moses's action in defense of his people has not just merely traveled far; it's reached the furthest edges of the city. Folks really know what went down, and therefore it adds to the drama and urgency of the situation.
Gosh, it certainly does, and you'd hope if that were the case that that it wouldn't have taken someone at the far end of the city to come and give him a warning. There might have been somebody nearer. It's like a sort of ambulance waiting time gone wrong, Anyway, but I loved what you just said about the impoverishment going with being in the shadow. If the shadow is actually a place of intimacy with God, you're almost under the shadow of God's wings. You only reach that point at the point where you're impoverished or in direst need. And it picks up on that language of settling, which we saw in the Hebrew, that this is a place of abiding, and yet you only reach it through adversity. And I found the three prayers that you hear in Moses, going on in Moses, really interesting in this short passage, as if they're a progression. He first of all asks, "Save me from the people who do wrong," and that's all about a sort of known object, a known outcome he wants to ensure through his prayer. Then something a little bit more open, like "Guide me in the right way," which doesn't specify. It's still a request for a specific thing, guidance, but doesn't quite know what form it will take. And then finally, a prayer which isn't a direct request at all. It's a description of himself. "I am in dire need of whatever good thing you may send me," but there's no actual petition. So in a way, it's the most open prayer of all. And that seems like a series of stages of progressive opening up, which just fit with what you were saying about this progression into intimacy with God through relinquishment or loss.
And just to add to that, I think the connection of being in dire need and the divine, that just takes me straight back to the Christian text. The idea that in those who are in the most need, there is a kind of encounter with God there. And just to add to that, I think Abdul Rahman, you were really touching on this. The idea that when he helps the girls, the women, he doesn't necessarily link that with his prayer to God. It's almost like an incidental act of goodness that he would do anyway. And then, it could go two ways, couldn't it? Either he could be saying, "Look, I've done this good thing. Come on, God, give me a little bit of quid pro quo." Or he could just do the good thing because that's what he does. He's a mensch, like in the Hebrew text. And then he kind of withdraws himself back into his withdrawn position and then speaks of his need. So I'm interested in which direction people think that goes in and how that affects how we read it.
We haven't heard from Gemma, and I'm always fascinated by what you have to say, Gemma.
Well, I'm sitting here with all sorts of other texts resonating in my head, particularly Psalm 91. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Almighty and abides in the shadow of his wings, but also Jesus's own Beatitudes. And the first blessing, the first Beatitude he preaches is "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And one translation I remember reading long ago had it, "Blessed are those who know their need of God." And it seems to me that that's, the trajectory that that Ben was sketching out, but that is a trajectory that I think belongs to every human person, of, in a sense, knowing our place in the universe, knowing that we are not God, that we are not almighty, that we have agency, but it's not ultimate agency, and therefore finding ourselves in a position of dependency on God and relationship with God, which at its best connects us with others whose dependency we recognize. And actually, in our reaching out to them, it's a reciprocal receiving from them a sense of our own need of God. Because I think there's always a difficulty, which was touched on before by Abdul Rahman, I think, of saying, look, we're not doing this for what we can get back, but I think also nor are we caring for others with a sense of our own grandiosity, with us a sense of noblesse oblige. What a fabulous person I am for reaching out to these poor people. Because actually, when we meet the poor, and I learnt this lesson very powerfully when I worked with people on the streets in the favelas of Brazil, and the thing I learnt from them was to recognize my own poverty. And it was a very, very radical lesson to someone who had always been secure. And suddenly I was in a position of utter insecurity. And that was reflected back to me by other people I was with who were lifelong living in insecurity. And it taught me something so powerful about myself, my place in the universe, but also my relationship with God. And I think it's when we meet other people in their need and their poverty, it's not just that we're doing a good deed, but that we're receiving a wisdom from them that is reflected back to us, which directs us straight back to God and our position before God of being people with empty hands.
And Gemma, that was so beautiful, and I feel like part of the way this text speaks to that as well is Moses's agency as well, right? He is in a state of neediness, and yet he continues to do. He flees, he helps, he does all these things, and you're so right. There's almost like he's doing these things. He's seizing his human agency, but constantly seeking to tie a God into it, and constantly stating his vulnerability. I work at a university where students often talk about being vulnerable, and we encourage vulnerability in the classroom, and we encourage real smart kids to come face to face with their own sort of places where they need to learn and grow. And here Moses, who has a relationship with God already, is teaching us constantly that one, anxiety and difficulty befall those who may even speak or be close to the divine, and that in every moment of our lives where we are vulnerable, traumatized, at unease, anxious, marginalized and displaced, there is that first return to God. Tether yourself to, and then go into the world and do. And I love that those two movements happening, subtly within the text.
Any last thoughts on this beautiful passage? While you're thinking, it reminded me of a conversation I had in a refugee camp with South Sudanese now friends who were asked what peace looked like. And they said, peace looks like a tree offering shade with fruit that brings food and water, a teacher, and God in our midst. And I always held on to that. The person who said it actually traveled with me all the way after leaving this refugee camp, all the way to Harvard University, and was asked that question by a Harvard student. And I just thought, what a profound answer, from someone who has seen the world from so many different perspectives. So I just thought I'd share that. Can I ask you, as we draw to a close, to share just one takeaway from our time together today? One takeaway for you personally, or for others who are listening.
It strikes me that the three texts work together in interesting ways. But one thing I'm taking away from this is they deal with the three crucial elements, perhaps, involved in all our relationships with people. They deal with the community level, they deal with the individual level, and they deal with the divine level. And I would link them up. I'd say the Torah text, the Hebrew text, is very much about somebody who leaves a community, finds a community, is dealing with strife in the community, becomes integrated in a new community, always misses, perhaps feels an allegiance to the original community. So it's very much a text that's phrased in the community dimension of running away, getting to other places. The New Testament text is very much about the individual relationship, the face of the other, as Levinas says, the one-to-one encounter, the what you can do, you as personal agent, and we've talked about the double aspect of that, the giving and the receiving, very much. And then the Quranic text is very much about the presence of God in this situation of running away and anxiousness and arriving somewhere else, about the divine dimensions. So I think one of the things you always find with scriptural reasoning is interesting things come out of the links between the texts, or the way the texts chime with each other. And for me, that's very much what's come out of this one, these three crucial ingredients with this whole situation of people being refugees and people receiving refugees, and that mutuality and all those three levels.
I've suddenly been possessed by the image of the tree in the Quranic text. I don't think it's there in the Hebrew. And there's something about the tree itself, because of course it's there because the well is there. They're sort of, because there's water, there can also be a tree. And the tree then becomes a place of shelter for Moses, and therefore it's symbolically important as well. But as we're thinking in this context about the poorest and most in need, those displaced or at risk, the tree might be something also to take account of. And so, in our particular context of environmental crisis, there's also a sense in which the tree might itself be one of the things that needs to be attended to, along with the hungry, the thirsty, the foreigner, and so on. And yet it too is able to give. And I think, as Lindsay was saying, all of the types and conditions of people who appear in these texts are both potentially givers and those in need of care. And it could be any of us on either side, and often both at the same time. And that's true also of the tree and the flocks, which need to be watered too.
I just pick up very much on a comment that was made earlier, that it's not just the people who actually realizing they're doing this in God's name or for God's sake who are the heroes, but the unconscious heroes, the heroes who do these things simply because they know it's just, simply because they know it's right. And in March, I was sitting in the Hauptbahnhof, the central station of Berlin, watching hundreds of volunteers greeting Ukrainian refugees coming off trains through Poland. And I just have this sense of these people with their arms held out. It was, gosh, even now, it was so moving to see these people just reaching out to someone else. And I have no idea what their motivation was, but it was just such a powerful thing to see these people at their most human, and people at their most needy and most human at the same time. And the power of these stories, I think, is is about that, is about finding within ourselves, in the face of the need of another, not only their deepest humanity, but our own. And that is why, we see that righteousness in people, whatever their motivation may be. When we see it, we recognize it for what it is.
What you were saying, Gemma, takes me back to the text of the Hebrew Bible, and that incredible way that our passage is concluded about strangeness, and how what you describe is almost like it's again, I come to that idea, I can't shake it, of a spiritual station of strangeness, of even in the sense of comfort and belonging. We know we are not truly comfortable. We don't know the vagaries of life and death. We're in this moment now, and how do we seize it, knowing that if we are not strangers or foreigners, we are going to become estranged from this world and everything that is around us. We're in a constant process of being estranged as we go through life. And that beautiful example you gave of the reaching out to the stranger, to the one arriving, is that I think we find we connect with our mutual estrangement, and in these moments that we feel disconnected, we see connection. And part of our connection is on the idea that we are all, in a way, refugees. And it reminds me of Mevlana's the beginning of the Mathnawi, where Jalaluddin Rumi reminds us of the reed flute cut from the reed bed, and hear its mournful sound, and it longs to return. Don't we all long to return? Aren't we all spiritual refugees? Aren't we all estranged in some ways? And how you actualize that, as the Christian text tells us, is just by doing, is by capturing that sense of service, duty, compassion, love, mercy, generosity, justice, because it comes from within, without regard for reward. And there's a beautiful plumb line that flows through these three texts. So thank you to those who chose them for us, and thank you to those of you who presented and allowed us to explore them. It really is very, very powerful and poignant.
Well, Abdul-Rahman, I think you put that so beautifully. I think I would just add one slight lens to that, which is that in these three texts, we're shown that refugees, that care for those who need it, is not something that we bestow from above, from a fortunate position to those who are in a needy position, but that actually it's Jesus who identifies with the least of them. It's Moses who is the refugee on the run. It's Moses in the Quranic text who is in dire need. And all three of our traditions identify with those who in need, at our very highest, most elevated leader. And so, yeah, it's not another, it's in all of us. That idea that I've been a stranger in a foreign land, whether in a physical situation or in a spiritual situation, like you say, Abdul-Rahman, it could be any of us, it will be all of us at some point in our lives.
And just to add to that, for me, the Hebrew Bible text was really what drove home that idea of some transcendent good or some value within every human being that's beyond social categories. Because it takes all these social categories and it breaks them down, and it shows them how internally contested and there's all sorts of tensions internally. But then what transcends that is just this desire to do good. I almost said to do God, but then that reminded me of the New Testament passage as well, which was, it kind of like blurs the line of what is worship. You can find God everywhere and find God in everyone. And so do good to everyone. You'll find God in everyone.
Thank you all. What a profound joy it is to come together, to hear from one another's scriptures, to share in our seeking of wisdom. Our profound thanks today to all of you: Hamza Zahid, Rabbi Lindsay Taylor-Goodhart, Rabbi Miriam Laurie, Dr. Gemma Simmons, Abdul-Rahman Malik, Professor Ben Quash. Thank you for joining me today and for the conversation you have generated and the wisdom you've shared with us. And thank you too to the Open University, to Jessica Giles and to Michael Wakelin, who made this possible, and also to Music Art and Media, who have supported us today.